In this video we're going to look at Ford's on-road driving modes for their four-wheel drives and SUVs using a next-gen RA Ranger. Now, what I mean by that is these modes here. We've got 2H, 4A, 4H and 4L. Now for the moment we're just going to concentrate on 2H and 4A, which are the on-road modes. 4L and 4H are the off-road modes. So to understand the difference between 2H and 4A, a bit of background. Now there's something called part-time four-wheel drive or part-time 4x4, otherwise known as selectable 4x4 or selectable four-wheel drive. And that's demonstrated by this diagram here. So it shows an engine, and the green means that the rear wheels on the vehicle are driven and the front wheels are just freewheeling around. So it's a rear wheel drive or two-wheel drive. So the front and the rear axles can turn at different speeds when the car goes around a corner, and that's used on surfaces like bitumen because you've got high traction. When you go around a corner you need the front wheel to turn quicker than the rear wheel, and just by driving the rear wheels it allows that difference in front and rear axle speed. Now when we're off-road, that is a low traction surface and we can actually lock the front and the rear together. We put the vehicle into four-wheel drive and now we're driving all four wheels, and therefore the front axle must turn the same as the rear axle, and that's the sort of terrain we use off-road. So vehicles like the 70 series here actually run in two-wheel drive, driving the rears only on bitumen roads, high traction surfaces, and are only four-wheel drive in off-road conditions. Then we get to all-wheel drive. Now that starts off similar, but for on-road purposes we've got something now called a centre differential, and this means that the engine can drive all four wheels, the rear axle and the front axle, but the centre differential allows the front axle to turn quicker than the rear axle going around a corner. So the front and rear can turn at different speeds, yet both are driven by the addition of a centre diff. Now sometimes it's not a centre diff, it's a centre clutch, a viscous coupling, but we'll call it a centre diff. So that's the sort of surface you can use that on. Now when we're off-road we lock that centre differential either manually or by a computer, and that's what those black lines mean. So that's now functionally equivalent to the part-time four-wheel drive in four-wheel drive. So the centre diff is locked, and then that means the front and the rear axles must turn at different speeds, and that's the sort of terrain you would use your locked centre diff in. So that's your all-wheel drive, also known as full-time four-wheel drive. Then we get into something called on-demand all-wheel drive, and that is typically driving the front wheels, and that means that front wheels are driven by the engine. We do have a centre diff here, but the rear wheels, and generally rear wheels, are just trailing, not doing anything, and they are driven when it is required. So for example, if we take this Volvo, it's off-road now, or semi-off-road on a dirt road, that would now need to drive the rear axle, so it would bring that rear axle into play. And so essentially it's mostly a four-wheel drive, but the rear axle is driven as and when is required. So that's your on-demand. Now we can also have on-demand on the rear as well, and that's actually what the Ranger has, because in 4A mode it drives the rear wheels all the time, but it will bring the front axle in and drive the front wheels as and when it needs to. Now let's talk about the drive modes and how they work. So there's 2H, 4A, 4H and 4L. We can split them up. These are your road modes, the 2H and the 4A, and the 4H and the 4L are your off-road modes. Now I'm not going to go into the off-road modes at the moment, really we'll talk about the road modes. So this is 2H, it drives the rear wheels only, and 4A, that is two-wheel drive and all-wheel drive. So it will drive two-wheel drive all the time and bring that front axle in as and when. The off-road modes over here, this will drive the four-wheel drive, all four wheels all the time. There's no disconnecting into two-wheel drive, and that's locking that centre diff. And 4L is the same, but that's in low range, and that's your crawler gear. The only difference between these two is that it's a lower set of gears. All right, so how does Ford's 4A system actually work? Well, this is its kind of normal mode, and it's just driving the rear axle, absolutely nothing else. But it will bring the front axle into play in certain conditions. And those certain conditions, from driving my own car, I've noted that it's actually a preemptive system, not a reactive system. One problem with many previous systems was that the car would wait for the front or the rear axle, whichever one wasn't driving, to slip, and then it would send torque or drive over to that axle. And that was always a lot less than ideal, because by the time it's slipping, you're in trouble. Well, the Ford system is preemptive. So if you accelerate away, you'll always seem to do that in all-wheel drive, never in two-wheel drive. And the only time you'd be accelerating in two-wheel drive when you're in 4A is at relatively high speed, about 80 k's an hour or there above, at small throttle movements. If you put your foot to the floor, it'll go to all-wheel drive. So you get all-wheel drive when pulling away, accelerating, cornering, and it comes in before there is any actual slip, and that's really good and important. And even when you are downshifting to go down a hill, you can see that that downshift rev match is actually put for all four wheels. And it's almost like the default is all-wheel drive, and it only disconnects that front axle when the vehicle is in some form of relatively high-speed cruise. And to me, it feels very much like a true all-wheel drive system where the front axle never disconnects. And trust me, that is high praise. I've driven a lot of these systems, and I do not say that about all of them, but this one I feel is in effect a true all-wheel drive system. So what does Ford say about it? Well, this is an excerpt from the manual. When you select four-wheel drive auto 4A, the system continually varies power to the front wheels for optimum performance in all road conditions, which is effectively what I've just said in more detail. So on the dash there's a display showing you which wheels are driven. You can see as I pull away it goes to all four, off to power only rear two, and as I get back onto power all four are driven again. Now doing a bit under 60 k's an hour here, and I'm going to put the car in manual mode. It's in fourth gear at the moment. So I'm going to change down, and you can see that the rev match change down actually goes through all four wheels. And if I go down into second gear about now, there you go, you can see again that's going through all four wheels. So you get engine braking, all-wheel drive. So on the flat, barely any throttle, but slow speed, so all four wheels being driven, coming around a bend, up the hill, applying throttle, and again, all four wheels helping us pull up. So 60 k's an hour, moderate throttle, we come up to 100 zone and we just increase the throttle, all four wheels starting to pull us again. But as the speed increases, the car goes, actually we don't really need the front axle to do anything with this very light acceleration at high speed, so we're just going to drive the rear wheels for the moment. Now, what difference does it make on fuel consumption? Well, I ran two tests, one in 2H, one in 4A, and you can see that they were identical. There was no difference in fuel consumption whatsoever. Now, if we take a Ford Everest, two-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, and look at the delta, the weight difference between the two-wheel drive and the four-wheel drive is 108 kilograms. Why? Because the two-wheel drive version does not have a front differential or drivetrain or anything else. It's literally missing those components. So it's over 100 kilograms lighter, and that means it doesn't have any friction either. So what difference does that make? Well, 0.1 fuel per litres per 100 fuel consumption, or 1%. In other words, next to nothing. Now, if we consider that a four-wheel drive Ranger or Everest in 4A weighs the same as a two-wheel drive, and you've still got that frictional effect from the front axle turning the front wheels turning the front axle and everything else. No surprise that there's no fuel consumption benefit by going from 4A to 2H or back again. So in effect, no difference in fuel consumption. Here's a GoPro under the front of the Ranger, and you can see everything is still turning. You're carrying that weight, it's going to be going around anyway, so you may as well use it to get extra traction. Why would you use 2H or 4A? Let's go through the pros and cons. So the pros, better on-road grip. Simple as that. If you pull away in wet conditions, even in dry conditions, particularly when cornering, you're less likely to get wheel spin. You can put your foot down and the car will just go, which is great. Towing is handy as well. You'll get better traction when you're towing, and trailer manoeuvring. When you're manoeuvring heavy trailers backwards, then definitely things help as well. Campsite and grass, if you're going around in low traction conditions on grass and so forth, then you can do that in 4A mode, and that will be fantastic. You're not going to rip anything up like you would in 4H, or suffer a loss of traction in 2H. Engine braking, that can even help as well. Coming downhill, it's actually engine braking all four wheels. And dirt roads, when it goes from dirt to bitumen and back again, that's really good as well, because then you're going to not worry going from two-wheel drive to four-wheel drive. You just got that good traction all the time. So my view is just leave it in 4A unless you want to drift, because I think that's really the only advantage of 2H. If you deliberately want to hang the back out, I can't really think of any other advantage. Fuel consumption certainly isn't one. So to demonstrate the traction difference, that's in two-wheel drive, and is the same again in all-wheel drive 4A. But what about the understeer? People say this, so, oh no, it feels understeer in all-wheel drive. Well, I don't think it does. And aside from four-wheel drives, I do a lot of sports car work and racing, and I don't really feel it's understeering. But let's talk a bit about it. It's not going to make no difference on corner entry when you're braking and turning in, right? It's going to be the same, 2H or 4H. The only difference it's going to make is when you are exiting out of a corner, you're putting the power down. And if you're wanting to rotate the back around under power, first of all, you shouldn't be doing that on a public road. Secondly, it's really hard to do in a Ranger because it's got an open diff. If it was an LSD, so much the better. But the best way to launch out of a corner in Ranger or Everest, which has this mode, is to put it into 4A and use all four wheels to come out of the corner. If you're getting chronic understeer, that's a you problem, so you need to learn to drive around it. And the other thing is that every single car on the market, Ranger included, even the sports car, is tuned for inherent understeer. That is the safest way to do it, and that's the way it works. So for me, I think you're just going to make quicker and safer progress in all-wheel drive. In this business of it's understeer, for me, that's just a complete non-issue. Now, I want to talk briefly about freewheeling hubs and part-time four-wheel drive as to where that comes in. So this is typically what would happen if a part-time four-wheel drive was put into two-wheel drive. You can see the front axle is not driven at all. Now with the hub set to 3, in effect that disconnects the wheels from the front axle, the diff and the front prop shaft. And that means that these components here do not turn. So you don't get the frictional losses associated with that. So this is where you might get a tiny increase in fuel consumption, because what the Ranger has and many other vehicles is that wheel turns this, you know, so even though it's not driven by the engine, it's still going around, it's still using energy. With freewheeling hubs, we're isolating all of that so it doesn't turn. So you actually do save a bit of petrol. So if you really wanted to save a bit of fuel, you need to fit freewheeling hubs to your 4A Ranger and drive it in 2H and set them to 3. But I really don't think that's worth doing it. Now, this system that Ford has is not new. It's very similar to things like Mitsubishi's Super Select, where you had 2H, 4H locked as they call it, and then low range. It's essentially the same thing. The difference with Super Select is that in 4H it drove all four wheels all the time, whereas the Ford system is clever and it will disconnect the front drive shaft or reconnect it depending on what the vehicle is doing. But essentially it's the same sort of system, and there's others apart from Mitsubishi's and Ford's. So I hope you found this video useful. Do let me know in the comments what mode you drive your Ranger in and why, and thank you for watching.